Hi, everybody. Hello, and welcome to our closing session today on fur farming history, the application of One Health. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It's really important to acknowledge that I'm on this land and with the animals in this territory. So my name is Victoria Schroff, and I'll be moderating this panel. I know you'll already know this by now, but please remember to post your questions for our speakers in the Q&A box, not in the chat, and state who your question is for. Questions will be asked throughout our discussion. We're here for an hour. So we have 5 panelists for this session. Please allow me to introduce them. We have Ms. Leslie Fox, Dr. Sarah Dubois, and CUCP Chief Judy Wilson, and MP Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, and Dr. Jan Hayek. So I'm just going to read mini bios for them. If you want a more fulsome bio, please go to the website and you will see them, as well as contact information. Leslie Fox is the Executive Director for the Fur Bearers, the co-founder of the Society for Humane Science, and the President and Board Chair for the Alberni Community and Women's Service Society. She is also a Certified Humane Education Specialist. Dr. Sarah Dubois is the Chief Scientific Officer at the BC SPCA. She has participated in cruelty investigations of mink fur farms in BC, which opened her eyes to the inherently inhumane practice and lack of protections for all animals in fur farms. Chief Judy Wilson is an executive member of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and she firmly believes in adhering to the principles of sustainability, conservation, and reconciliation to protect sacred waters, lands, animals, and traditional ways for generations to come. Nathaniel Erskine-Smith has been the Member of Parliament for Beaches East York since 2015. He's a founding member of the Liberal Animal Welfare Caucus and the All-Party Animal Welfare Caucus, which he also chairs. He has introduced legislation on a number of issues related to animal rights and plans to continue to be steadfast in his support for animals and animal welfare. Dr. Jan Hayek is an infectious disease specialist at Vancouver General Hospital and a clinical assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. He is particularly concerned about zoonotic infections and has had frontline clinical experience with pandemic diseases. And I, Victoria Schroff, am one of the first and longest serving animal law lawyers in Canada, the longest serving in BC, and author of a current textbook, Canadian Animal Law. I also teach animal law at 2 universities. So for more details on people's bios, please go ahead and look at them on the website. So let's welcome our panelists to the screen. I think most of them are in here now. And I'm going to start with what our thesis is today on fur farming. We are in a pandemic era, which has had an enormous impact on both human and animal welfare in our interconnected world. So fur farming needs to be scrutinized for the risk it poses to both human and animal health. This is the concept of One Health, which you've been hearing about so far today from Barbara Cartwright and others, and you will continue to hear about through the conference. Now, each panel member today is going to lead off by answering one question. This is basically a chance for each speaker to provide their own mini summary presentation around our joint topic. We're not doing slides, we're actually presenting as a panel. So to get the panel started, I have one question for each panelist to please explain to our audience here today. And I call it kind of like an elevator pitch question. So our panelists will have up to 5 minutes to answer this question. And we're going to start off with Chief Judy Wilson. And I'm going to ask Judy Wilson to please share a critical Indigenous perspective guided by mandates provided by the UBCIC Chiefs Council through resolutions, insight on UBCIC's principled approach to fur farming and wildlife management, which considers Indigenous ways, title and rights, stewardship, conservation, climate change impacts. Please take it away, Chief Judy.
Waikakwaitet, which means hello in our language. I'm calling in from the unceded Secwepemc Ulu, which is our Shuswap or Secwepemc territory in the interior of British Columbia in Canada. And Cookby means chief in our language, so chief within the Sconlet Indian Band, and I'm Secretary Treasurer to the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And we've had an interrelation, if you will. We call them the natural laws or creation laws from our creator. So we are interrelated to all living things, which includes the animals, the Mother Earth, the water. and we have caretaker responsibility towards those that cannot speak. So that includes all of the animals. And a lot of the animals are like our guardian spirits and have teachings for us. So the relationship to the wildlife is really important to us, and also taking care of them. So we, while we do sustenance hunting and fishing and things like that, and gathering plants and medicines and stuff, we never take more than we need. And then we also do like a ceremony and an offering when we do go hunting, and we use every part of the animal, like nothing goes to waste, so to speak. And that's our interrelationship with our animals. And there's lots that are held sacred, in a sense that meaning that we have sacred teachings from them, and then also they could be our guardians as well. And modern day too, we also did trapping and things like that, but always in respect to the animals. So the farming of the animals is very concerning to us. In BC, we did shut down, work with SPCA and Fur Bears and some of the other groups to shut down the mink fur farms and the chinchilla farms during the COVID exposures. But there's lots of work in teaching people the interrelationship with our wildlife and our Mother Earth and the water, because they're all interrelated and all connected. So we have to have that bond and that connection and that sacredness and the relationship in how we're not just treating animals as commodities, or not just treating animals, that they don't have a meaning or a purpose, because they all do. And I'm working with a lot of different groups right now on the wolf protection, and so doing that. And then we also worked with, getting the buffalo back on the grasslands, and we also worked in protecting the grizzly bears, and then the all of the other animals that are out there. But I wanted to say I'm sorry I have to leave. I've got an elder in the hospital right now that I need to tend to. So I'm sorry. That's about as much as I can do. Thank you. Hello?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming at all today, considering your circumstance. Okay, so what we're going to do is we won't be doing a follow-up in that regard with Chief Judy, but thank her very much for her insights, especially around the idea of animals not being commodities and so forth, and also talking about the interconnections. Our next question is for Dr. Jan Hayek. Please explain the public health risks inherent in industrial fur farming, both during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, please.
So thank you for the question. It's a difficult question. I tried to prepare some answers for it. And the questions are for both before and after the pandemic. And so before the pandemic, I think the main risk is that industrial fur farming, which involves keeping thousands of animals at a high risk, highly susceptible to COVID-19, closely together, and also in regular contact with people, the risk there is developing novel variants, potentially dangerous variants. So when the virus naturally circulates amongst the human population, it develops variants. But when the virus, and this SARS-CoV-2 virus, can jump from different species, from animals maybe to minks, foxes, raccoon dogs, civet cats. As it does that, and it's forced to adapt to the new species, it accelerates the selection for these variants and mutations. And so this is the risk, that there's an added risk for developing these mutations and novel variants, and those are relatively unpredictable. They could be more or less lethal, more or less transmissible, or resistant to our immune system. And this is what happened previously in Denmark and the Netherlands. A virus jumped from circulating in humans into mink fur farms, circulating amongst those mink fur farms, developed additional mutations, potentially dangerous variants, and then back into humans and into the community. And that risk prompted Denmark and Netherlands to stop fur farming during this pandemic. In BC, we also had the experience of outbreaks on mink fur farms from the virus spreading from humans to mink. And that first started in December, and then the government put in additional precautions, offering vaccine to workers, screening workers twice a week with PCR, wearing masks. But despite that, another outbreak happened in May. And that just illustrates the fact that although we were taking precautions, that there is a risk that persists while these mink fur farms exist. And then to add about what happens after the pandemic, I think after the pandemic, it's expected that this virus won't disappear, that it'll become endemic. And that risk will continue. We'll still have some people like seasonal COVID, we'll still get COVID, and then the virus could go into the mink again, develop novel variants. And at that time, the risk won't be just prolonging the pandemic, it'll be triggering a whole new pandemic. And these risks of developing a potentially novel variant that will extend our pandemic or make a more dangerous pandemic, they're likely low, but it's unclear, and it's definitely not zero. And so how we decide to respond to these risks that are there and potentially catastrophic depends on things like our risk tolerance and our societal values. I'm gonna
Thanks
end
very
there, and
much.
I'll wait for questions.
I have a little follow-up question to just what you said there, and that relates to the idea of, before, when we've seen the type of pandemics that we've had in the past with SARS and stuff, we didn't have as much of an input from animal welfare at that point. But now we've seen that happen. And do you think that the medical community is receptive to hearing about One Health concepts?
I think they are. I think they are. But, there's an issue with including the animal and how we use animals. And we use them a lot for food and for uses and for fur. And I was just on a call yesterday for climate and greenhouse gas emissions efforts for the hospital. And there was a slide saying that we should make land have personhood, but not animals. And not so I think that there is need, I think, to emphasize kind of like what Chief Judy Wilson said before about treating animals not as commodities, but as individuals as well. And for the animal welfare, I think there was an outcry about animal welfare in live animal markets and wildlife markets in other countries. But those risks, for example, the people in those contexts may want to tolerate those risks or may feel societal value in those risks. And so it's difficult for us to judge other people. And I think we are also tolerating certain risks. And I think it's important to reevaluate those risks and prioritize maybe public health and other things, just to make sure that we're not exposing the world to potentially unnecessary risks.
Thanks very much. Okay, we're going to move on to Dr. Sarah Dubois, and I will ask her to please explain about the inherent inhumaneness and welfare issues of fur farming, please.
Thank you, Victoria. So when we say the term inherently inhumane and how this applies to an industry like fur farming, this means that this is not a practice that can be refined or changed in a way that can actually improve the welfare for the animals to a level which we would still find to be acceptable. And when we talk about what is humane, because of course many people have different understandings of that term, and for some people it is on a spectrum, for others it's pretty clear cut, it's one or the other, but we can look to a structure where there's something that is defined as legally humane, so it may be allowed in practice because of the regulations and laws or standards that exist, and that is the case of fur farming in Canada. It is a legal practice, and so people do defend it, saying we would never allow something inhumane to happen legally. But then when you look at the other layers and you look from a science perspective, from animal welfare science, we can measure humaneness. We know what pain, suffering, both at a physical and physiological and psychological level is. And so is a practice scientifically humane? And we can assess that in fur farming and say, no, it is not humane. We also look at societal's definition of humane, and that includes our ethics, our moral compass as a society. And we can definitely say that, Leslie and I were here actually in 2015 in person in Richmond speaking about fur farming. And we're here many years later saying, of course, this is not a practice that society knows about, is happening in their own backyard. They're not really participating in it. This is a completely export market for fur farming. So why are we doing this with taxpayer dollars? And that's another conversation. But when it comes to these animals, think of the animals' experience. Mink, yes, they've been bred in captivity for over 100 years, but so have tigers. So are we going to say that a tiger is appropriate animal in captivity? People would jump on that and say we would never farm tigers in Canada. But when it comes to another semi-aquatic, carnivorous animal that spends most of its time alone over several kilometers of a home range, this animal spends its time of its day and night. It's kind of a nocturnal species. At dusk and dawn, it's very active. It's hunting, it's swimming, it's exploring its territory. It needs, these challenges and enrichment of scent and sound. And that is something it can't experience in an industrial fur farming operation. And so this is where we have been saying for this issue for many years that this is not something that is a life worth living for these animals. And that's really what it comes down to, is that we can't make this practice humane. And so it does need to end. And of course, many other reasons now that you hear that these animals are our relations, they are not our resources. This is the Indigenous way of having a relationship with our land and our animals, as well as the public health emergency. And this is what has brought this into the spotlight again. And it is concerning to me, at least, and others on this panel, that British Columbia so far is the only region where COVID has been tested and found in the populations of these farmed animals. So what is happening on other farms where we know have even larger scale operations in other parts of Canada?
Yeah, thank you so much. There's a lot of food for thought. We actually had a question come in, and the question is directed to either Sarah or Yan. How are you navigating misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation in today's climate? One of our audience members has asked that. So either of you want to, one of the doctors want to answer that? Give us the science answer?
Well,
I can try. It's extremely difficult. So there's a tons of misinformation, disinformation. I think it's important to call it out and to address it. I think it's very difficult, but I think that's important. I think yes. I think there's all kind of like advocacy or activism. I think there's all kinds of ways to do it, but I think it is important to try to address misinformation. And I think it's a terrible thing. It's identified by the WHO as one of the kind of critical public health threats.
It's about transparency. So we don't know, number of farms is transparency. So in order to combat disinformation and misinformation, we need transparent knowledge of where these farms are, how many animals they have, and what's happening to them on these farms. And so that's not happening right now. And that's where I think it's easy for misinformation to spread about what practice is happening, because we don't have access to these particular farms from either an inspection facility type of approach, or even when it comes to a cruelty investigation, we shouldn't have to wait for a whistleblower to call for help.
No, exactly. And we're going to unpack that a little bit further too when we talk about the idea of national fur farm regulations and laws when we get to MP Nate's presentation. But right now we're going to transition over to Leslie Fox to please explain how effective and strategic advocacy will help bring an end to fur farms, please.
I think it helps bring an end to fur farming because it raises the consciousness of decision makers, society, media, scientists, and the industry itself. Our campaign work in BC, in my view, was successful because a group of fantastic people who care came together. And I think to tackle animal issues as an animal welfare organization, it's really incumbent on us to bring in all the experts, because I think as we go forward, we're learning more and more that animal issues don't happen in a silo. They're connected to human health. They're connected to the environment. They're connected to the climate crisis. They're connected to oppression and power. And so there are these big, complicated themes that are happening. Anytime animals are used, we're speaking to a variety of interests and a variety of disciplines, really. And so to tackle the issue from an advocacy perspective, it requires an interdisciplinary approach, using an interdisciplinary lens, pulling in medical experts, pulling in environmentalists, pulling in people who are business savvy, just looking at the numbers, the statistics, how much money these farms generate, how much money is doled out in, government supports and subsidies. Is it worth it? Just a cost benefit analysis. And that's really what happened here. Again, looking at the fur farming issue from all of these perspectives, including Indigenous perspective as well, rounding this all out, putting it through the washing machine and coming up with, again, cost benefit. What do we stand to gain as a society, and what do we stand to lose? And it's just not there. With fur farming, the polls are very clear. Over 80% of Canadians oppose fur farming across the board. And I think it's the last holdout really is government and having that political will. Political will is the last piece of our puzzle here, but I think it's becoming, clearer and clearer, and the writing's on the wall.
Thank you very much. This sort of ties in with one of the questions we were asked. And somebody's saying, for the most part, fur is not needed anymore. There are so many alternatives, and even big fashion industries are dropping fur from their clothing. I'm trying to understand why fur farming is not banned in Canada. It should have been banned years ago. I rarely see people wearing fur. Leslie, do you have a comment on that? Or should I leave that for Nate?
Much of fur is exported, so it's not staying in Canada. So a lot of our fur is exported to countries including China and Russia. I think the reason why we have fur farms, quite frankly, is they're highly subsidized. They're propped up by federal government. They're propped up by provincial governments. There's all kinds of handouts. And fur farming, don't forget, hides behind big ag. And that's really what we're talking about. Fur farming is part of the Ministry of Agriculture. It's defined as an agricultural practice. And that's really weird because it's not a food product. It's not tied to, what some people would argue is, being an essential service. It's this sort of frivolous activity connected to fashion, but it hides behind agriculture. And in doing so, they're protected. And so it's our view, if you were to pull them out of agriculture and the subsidies and have them stand on their own 2 feet as their own entity, they would have disappeared a long time ago.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. Thank you. There's something that I always say, and I think that this fits in nicely with what all of us have said so far, and that is that the idea of farming is so much more than an animal rights issue. We've gone beyond it to include humans, to include agriculture, to scrutinize all these practices. And as Sarah, you summarized it very nicely, saying relations, not resources, taking up the Indigenous thread. I think that it lies at the heart of where we're going. And I know when Nate, you stood up and introduced your fur farming bill, I mean, you basically said right off the bat, this is cruel. And without too much further ado, we're going to get over to Nate now, and he's going to tell us about the current state of fur farming laws and policy, and about his 2022 bill, C-247, to ban fur farming throughout Canada. Go ahead, Nate. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Victoria. And I really would want to thank my previous speakers be here, because it is based on their work in many respects that I am able to do the advocacy that I do. Sarah Dubois' work highlighting the cruelty in existing mink farms, Jan Hayek's work highlighting the infectious disease risk. And when it comes to Leslie Fox and the fur bearers, I mean, they have for many years now highlighted this challenge, and they've tried to take, as I think Leslie just rightly articulated, and I try to do the same thing when I can, but to highlight the expertise and highlight the advocacy that exists both in animal science and in infectious disease risks, and to say this needs to change, and it needs to change now. And from a parliamentary perspective, I mean, I would share many of the perspectives that Leslie shares in terms of the challenges when you try to change some of these rules and you're up against the stakeholder politics of Agriculture Canada, and in some cases, a cross-party consensus that we should put economic interests ahead of animal interests and ahead of public health. And that has to be challenged. I think it is challenged properly by citizens on a regular basis when they write to MPs, and it is starting to break through in a serious way. And so we've seen in the last number of years, finally, animal welfare issues put on the map, not as seriously as they should be, but more seriously than they have been. And I hope we all take seriously going forward this idea of a One Health approach. And I know it's been talked about already here at the conference, but this core idea that animal health, human health, and environmental health are deeply interconnected is true on the academic literature. It is recognized in international dialogue. And I don't think we have truly come to terms with what it means on a national domestic basis, because here we have an issue with respect to commercial fur farming that is an obvious way we would implement a One Health approach. It is horrible treatment of animals that has direct impacts upon public health. And when you have the province of BC that has finally come to terms with this in a real way, and you have the BC Public Health Officer, Chief Public Health Officer, state the risk that commercial fur farming and industrial fur farming poses, I think it's incumbent on us at the national level to take that seriously, to take the very same lessons, and frankly, to do what other countries have done many, many years ago. So my bill, C-247, was really a product of me going to the legislative drafters and saying, I want to do what the UK did 20 years ago, because the UK effectively phased out commercial fur farming, and they did so by way of effectively saying a small there will be some compensation for farmers, but this practice should no longer exist. And I think we as Canadians, and I know the numbers bear this out when you look at the cross-party consensus of Canadians, although not yet the political representation of those Canadians, but I think we have to make the same point, which is to say, from all perspectives, from the Indigenous perspective we've heard, from the infectious disease perspective, from any Canadian who cares about animals perspective and basic dignity for animals, the way we treat animals in the context of commercial fur farming is cruel, wrong, it puts us all at risk, and it's past time that we put it to an end.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There's a question for you, Nate, that's come in through the chat saying, Nate, we're about to have an election in Ontario. Any suggestions for what would actually get a provincial party leader to add a promise to end fur farming to their platform?
I'm not certain of the politics in Ontario, given the writ is to be dropped effectively now, and platforms are already written. So I think the best bet, and I don't think this only applies to Ontario, but this applies to all of our politics. If you as an individual want to make a difference, there are organizations, wonderful organizations like the Fur Bearers that you can get involved with. But I would also say, don't dismiss partisan politics. So it can be unappealing to many people. I understand that. But it is the system in which we live. And so and I'll give you an example. I had a wonderful constituent who knocked on doors for me, who contributed to my campaign, who was an upstanding member of my community, but also really seriously involved in my own politics. And she really cared about the seal hunt, as an example. And I can tell you that if you make your focus getting involved and participating, not sort of opposing the political but getting involved to support the political representation you want to see, and building a relationship with your representative or the candidate of your choice, and ensuring that they, over time, highlight these issues because they understand these issues, because you have educated them on these issues, and they understand they're there to represent you, and they understand that you care about this issue in a serious way. I would not dismiss, obviously, meet your MP, meet your MPP, but I really would emphasize participating in nomination races, participating in election campaigns, and being involved, even if you never talk about animal issues with your candidate today, but you talk about it after the election. Just building that relationship is so crucially important to being listened to and being the educator that we really need you to be successful in the long term.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have another question that's come in. This is ostensibly said toward Nate, but I think that Leslie may also have something to say here. Let's say in the perfect world, commercial fur farms are banned. What will the workers do? We need a way to not alienate the workers. And I know, Leslie, you've commented on this before, and I believe, Nate, you have as well. Leslie, would you like to kick us off?
Absolutely. And that's something certainly we've considered. It's always difficult when you advocate for a variety of issues because effectively it can and does affect people's jobs. We're very aware of that. And that's frustrating and it's difficult. Anytime you have social or moral progress, it can leave people behind. Technological advances, rotary phones, moving to a different phone, getting rid of the yellow pages, and now we have to do something else. Blockbuster closes, we can stream our videos. People are left behind all the time, and every day people's jobs end and transition into something else. And so I think part is a personal responsibility, to be quite honest, to value education, to try new things, to update our skill set, and to be in occupations that allow for growth and change. I also think that it's incumbent upon the government, to provide help, to make it easy for workers to transition to other industries, to provide incentives and supports, resources. An example is greenhouse work. And so we've seen that recently where there's other programs and opportunities, for workers to move into other forms of agriculture. I think when it comes to the fur industry, I would say there is a bit of a habit from the industry to oversell the job angle. And we have to be really critical of that. So when people start talking jobs, you need to unpack that a little bit, because oftentimes we hear jobs, but what we're really talking about are part-time jobs that are seasonal, that are low paying, and frankly unsafe many times. And so is it really worth defending? Is it really worth investing in a sector that treats people so poorly, in addition to animals? And so I would really argue that, again, I think there are a lot of opportunities there, and we should really be investing in the future. And the future is solutions for the climate crisis. It's clean energy. It is technology. That's the future. Frankly, there's no future for fur farming.
Thank you.
And to pick up on what Leslie just closed with, transitions in some industries are necessary and they are inevitable. And we have already seen a precipitous decline in the export of mink fur from Canada. That is going to continue. And the way we manage transitions is incredibly important, but it is not specific to fur farming. So whether it is asbestos, whether it is, I'm later today on a panel discussion around phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, and in the decades to come, we are going to continue the transition away from fossil fuels. And when you look at the way we eat, I think in the coming decades, we're going to see a transition away from the way we consume industrial produced meat as well. And so these transitions are going to have impacts upon employment. Not all of that employment, as Leslie has said, is quality employment, but regardless, it is employment. And so when we look at supporting a transition, you need governments that are going to invest in skilling up skill training for workers. You need governments to invest in income security for both business owners who are being transitioned and also for workers. And you need to make sure the governments are making investments in communities that have traditionally relied upon a particular industry that is no longer going to exist as a matter of necessity and inevitability. And that's why I emphasize the UK model, because they emphasize the importance not only of ending a particularly cruel practice, but of transitioning via compensation the farmers who are involved in that practice at that time.
Thank you so much. That's very comprehensive. The question for Sarah and Yan: vaccines are being developed to manage COVID-19 in animal populations and being supported in the U.S. industry and abroad. Once these products are available, how will that affect the potential regulatory implications and the future of the fur farming industry? BC seems to be on its own course with fur farming and diverging from other jurisdictions. So once I guess to sort of summarize the question a bit, once a vaccine is available, how will BC be able to defend its current position as the participant?
It's a great question, and I'll just start by saying that vaccine is still experimental and it is being used on the East Coast right now. But Jan will get into the epidemiology of it, but it's not going to prevent COVID from circulating in this population of animals. And so it's something that helps to manage potentially some risks. But I think it's really important that this is a significant investment. Who's paying for these vaccines? So are your tax dollars paying for them? Is this something that you're continuing to subsidize to put a product over the seas to continue the inhumane practice just by giving these animals a vaccine? So I'll let Jan finish.
Yeah, I agree. I think that vaccines so far are experimental, and we don't know so much about their performance characteristics. Chances are they may decrease the mortality of mink on fur farms, but we don't know how much they will reduce transmission or the risks of spread from minks to humans. We just don't know that, and we do know that clearly there are minks that have had SARS-CoV-2 infection, have been sick, have recovered, had antibodies positive, and then been sick again. And we've seen that too with humans and vaccines. So vaccines are useful, but they're not a panacea. And so I think how will we regulate that everyone will be vaccinated? I'm all for it, but I think it's not a solution. So
Yes, no, it's true. And with a lot of things related to animals and the law, it's about enforcement. We can have as many regulations as we like, but it's a question of, do we have the resources to back it up and the enforcement? And I'm sure that this comes in a lot of times with Nate when you're proposing legislation. People are saying, how are you going to enforce that? How's this going to actually be operationalized? And I think this becomes part of the difficulty in moving forward, but it shouldn't allow people to be stymied because of it. We need to brainstorm solutions, because ultimately we would like to see an end to inhumane practices like fur farming. And I think off of what Dr. Sarah said at the beginning, if we cannot refine this practice humane, then what are we doing here? What are we still doing with fur farming? Now somebody has asked a question that's a little bit off the topic for today, but also super relevant. So I'm going to ask it. And they're asking about, they're saying poultry farming is a much larger risk for human health and a future pandemic. Why is there so much focus on fur farming? Who would like to grab that one?
I'd say that poultry farming, it's arguable. I'm not sure which is a bigger risk. I'd say both are big risks, and these are relatively unpredictable. And I'd say that if we think of COVID-19, that minks probably are a bigger risk here, and the initial animal may have been a mink or a raccoon, dog, or civet cat that caused this pandemic. And so I think mink are uniquely susceptible to COVID-19, and that's the big risk. If we're talking about influenza, well, mink are also susceptible to influenza. They're susceptible to avian influenza, pig influenza, and human influenza. And mink on fur farms are being fed raw chicken product. And so they are at risk of kind of contributing to that risk that we see with avian influenza. So the mink are on top of that. So, and then I'd say it's on necessity and kind of what we need and scale and things. And I think that the mink fur farming industry may be an unnecessary risk, maybe that then you kind of think, how are we going to balance this risk? Do we need this risk? Can we live with it? Getting rid of this risk? And I think those are all evaluations that are necessary. So,
yeah, can I build on that point, Victoria?
Please.
So I think part is tolerance, isn't it? Societal tolerance. And so when you look at chicken farming and avian flu and what's happening now, I don't even know how many chicken farms there are in BC. Sarah might know, but presumably a lot. With mink farms, there's 9 mink farms. And most of them have been in financial trouble for many, many years. The number of fur farms continues to plummet across Canada. The number of companies committing to fur-free policies, the development of new textiles, all these other things. The industry is not doing well. And so I think when you look at society's tolerance combined with the viability of an industry, and I think you end up with, is it worth it? And so I think the tolerance for allowing chicken farming to continue is a lot higher because, you know, people are a lot more invested in it. There's more money invested in it, and it's linked to a food product for some people. You know, where fur farming, again, it's largely exported for bits of trim on coats, and so there's no real societal benefit there. Therefore, I think, again, the tolerance to allow fur farming to continue, it doesn't make any sense. So it's you know, I think any industry that uses animals, of course, needs careful consideration for sure. But I think with fur farming, this is a cruelty and a risk. You know, we can stop.
Absolutely.
And I would just say, could I just add that a One Health approach unquestionably needs to be applied across all sectors, across all departments, across all levels of government, and across all sectors. And certainly industrial animal agriculture writ large poses serious risks as it relates to antimicrobial resistance and certainly pandemic risk. And the United Nations Environment Program highlights increased demand for animal protein as one of the key drivers of pandemic risk. At the same time, I think it's right when you look at the fact that one is a source of food and the other is a source of fashion. There's a difference there that Canadians will look to and that will that will see a real difference. And so on the food side, I would say we need to make sure that we continue to operationalize the food guide, that we make sure that we are, you know, as much as possible supporting plant-based foods, that there are that we absolutely and maybe sell ag as far as it goes, but certainly we look to that problem and we try to address that problem. But in the case of mink and in the case of COVID specifically, I just think it's wild that anyone would come to this question and look at the status quo and say, you've just been through a global pandemic that has cost millions of lives, that has cost billions and billions of dollars to bridge people through this pandemic, and economies have suffered to a significant degree, not only our health, but our economies. And this frivolous activity poses a serious risk to continuing the pandemic via variants. And you're just going to let it continue. Like that is an impossible, like that, there's no rationality to the status quo, and it obviously needs to change. So to what Dr. Hayek said, I mean, it is bizarre in this particular crisis that we wouldn't take action specifically on ending commercial fur farming because of the unique challenge it poses in relation to mink and raccoon dogs and the transmissibility that we know exists in not only live animal markets elsewhere, but in commercial fur farming here at home.
And there are also issues, just to sort of take up on this in terms from a consumer point of view. A lot of the labeling laws that we have are very ineffective. So you could be at a dollar store and pick something up thinking you've picked up a little pen with a little bit of fur on the end and it says faux fur, and it's probably real fur. So that's just, I just want to throw that little consumer tip in there. Generally speaking, to show about how the public is really not made aware of a lot of things related to the industry, related fur. Many people come to me, how do we have fur farms? And one of the questions echoes this. They're saying, why do you think Canada is so far behind other countries in animal welfare issues, such as the fur farming ban? What's going on here globally? When, you know, I mean, I'm adding to this question, but I mean, we saw what happened in Denmark. We saw the bloated mink floating. I mean, you know, it's a horrible image. Nate, do you want to address that? I think it's sort of aimed at you, and there's sort of a tack onto this question for Nate. It's a thank to him. It said, it's so wonderful hearing someone in politics genuinely working towards a sustainable future for people, animals, and the planet. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that, although I would say it's only as a result of the work of advocates like Leslie and expertise from Sarah and Jan. And in terms of the international experience, I emphasize this in my remarks on C247 as well. I mean, the three core ideas that we have to hold as we advocate for an end to commercial fur farming are that the obvious cruelty to animals and the evidence that backs that up, the obvious risk to public health, and then lastly, the fact that there already is serious international movement. Canada is not a leader here. We need to play catch up. And so when you've got the UK that was an initial mover 20 years ago, you've got many other jurisdictions in response to this current public health crisis, and not only the international experience, but even the experience here at home with BC. It is now up to the federal government to play catch up in following the evidence.
So this sort of leads me to a question for Dr. Yan, and that is that, was this pandemic to a large extent avoidable in relation to how we've treated animals? Like, fur farming is just one component of that.
I think that's a question. I think it's a difficult question to answer definitively because we don't know exactly how it started, but the evidence so far points to an animal or animals that were sold in a live animal market for food or for something. And so, yes, if we weren't selling those animals in that market, then it probably wouldn't have led to this pandemic. So I think it's clear that the way we use animals, that these are known. Like we're saying that these are risks. We're saying that if you're continuing to do this, this is a risk. You can prolong the pandemic. So if it's avoidable, yes, and I think these are not necessary things. But I think it is. It's not. It can be challenging to stop some of these things, and it takes movement. It takes pushing. I think when China stopped wildlife farming, that they did provide subsidies. They did provide supports for people to be able to transition to other industries. And I think that's important. It's to say, like, this is important for us as a society. We want to reduce these risks and we want to help sustain our populations. And so I think predictable, avoidable, I think so, yes.
Yeah. And this is a question for Sarah and Leslie. Tell me about the cultural component that people sometimes use to say why fur farming should continue or why other types of inhumane animal use should continue. The cultural hook.
I imagine that use of culture or tradition is, the overall overarching term that many people use to justify some inhumane practices, and we see this in many different fields. But I think culture evolves, tradition evolves. As Leslie said, jobs evolve. And so there is, some catch up to play here, but I think it's more about just recognizing that as a society, our moral compass is changing over time as we learn more, as we have more information, as we know more about the physical experience of animals. I think that, that has been fundamental over the last 50 years, that has changed our opinion of that animals can experience pain and emotion, that has made a significant difference as well. And so to say that something we did 100 years ago with the information we have today is still relevant is just, not coherent.
So yeah, Leslie, picking up on the making fur history and using culture as defense.
Absolutely. Working on the fur issue is really challenging. I mean, certainly it's winnable. I believe one day we're going to get there for no other reason than just the technological advancements in the textiles. I mean, it's amazing what's coming out these days in terms of water repellency and warmth and durability. And fur is just, as a colleague mentioned, bad design. It's completely replaceable as a textile. And so why do we have it? Well, we have it because we always had it. And in Canada, and I think because Canada was built on the fur trade, therein is the problem. There's a real nostalgia and sense of Canadiana when we start talking about the fur and fur trade. And what makes fur farming specifically interesting is it really speaks to sort of these colonial roots. And fur generally, has these colonial roots. It was because Europeans came over and had this insatiable demand for fur pelts to make hats, and we forget our history. And thank goodness we have people like, Chief Wilson reminding us of just a sense of, common sense and decency here is we've lost this relationship and this connection with animals and particularly wildlife, and this commodification of animals to turn them into hats or clothes. Particularly, the fur issue really speaks to power and status. it was a product to really showcase wealth is where it came from, and fur farms were sort of this lazy answer to mass produce, to control and manipulate outcomes. So specific quality or color of fur, you can manipulate that in a controlled setting, unlike trapping, for example. And so fur farms were really interesting because you can create sort of this reliable quantity to supply demand. But of course, as years gone on, the whole thing is kind of backfired on the industry. And I think as we take Indigenous reconciliation seriously, I think it does call on us to revisit some of the history we were taught in school, and this notion that the fur trade was somehow this awesome, successful event, and Canada was built on the fur trade, and Hudson's Bay was one of the first businesses in Canada. And this whole throwback, I think we might want to rethink that and maybe not advertise that so much anymore as being this sort of well-regarded part of our past. And if anything, I think it's a real lesson for us to reconsider, some of those teachings and again, look to our Indigenous communities to remind us where we really came from. And lots of dynamics in that. And again, just really rethinking tradition and what does that mean and what does that look like, and is this really a tradition worth keeping?
Exactly. Yeah. The phrase rethink mink comes to mind. Rethink beaver pelts. I mean, this idea, this romantic, this faux romantic looking back on our history without looking at the colonial tentacles is really, really destructive. And I think, in her remarks, Chief Judy said, we never took more than we needed. And then when, the British and the French came over and started doing the fur trade and everything was going for export. Hey, how is that different than now? In a sense, we haven't escaped our colonial past.
No. And fur farming just perpetuates that. And it's just really inconsistent with Indigenous values and ways of knowing. And, this mass production. And really what we're talking about is the farming of wildlife. And I would really challenge that, when, fur farming wildlife, is that farming? And it's interesting to me, we throughout our campaign work, we've heard from farmers, and farming is hard. Farming is very hard. It's very risky. It's a lot of work. It's very expensive. And some farmers actually take offense to this idea that a fur farmer would consider themselves a farmer, and so that's sort of for them to sort out. But as an observer, I find that dynamic really interesting when we talk about farming and what does it mean to be a farmer and this notion of farming wildlife. And I think anytime you manipulate wildlife to be anything but wild, we're asking for trouble. And COVID is a great example of that. When we create these wildlife markets and, we have wild animals in captivity, and it really sets us up for failure in so many ways. To be a wild animal is to be wild, and we need to honor that.
We've all been agreeing. So one thing I would differ slightly with is I actually think it's perfectly fine to discuss this as farming when it comes to in the industrialization of animal agriculture, because I think that there are challenges that exist with fur farming, and I think they exist in similar ways when we look at the industrialization of animal agriculture, the way we, as Chief Wilson discussed, the commodification of animals, sentient beings, as Dr. Dubois just emphasized, that we know much more about their sentience and that they think, love, feel, and build relationships, and yet we treat them as any other property to squeeze a profit out of as much as reasonably possible, regardless of a basic sense of humanity. And so I take the point that it's of a different kind, but I do think it also is representative in some ways of the challenge that we all face when it comes to the industrialization of animal agriculture and the cruelty that is born out of that, but also the public health risks that are born out of that in different ways and more acute in this case with respect to COVID. But I think it's an opportunity to emphasize the need to end commercial fur farming, but also to reemphasize the sentience of animals and to reemphasize that we need to reconsider the relationship we have with animals, not only as it relates to fur farming, but more broadly as well.
100%.
Thank you. Thank you. We're down to our last 4 minutes. So what I'd like to do is to have everybody give a 30-second outro for anything they may want to say. I'm not putting you on the spot. Just raise your hand if you would like to say something, and then go.
Well, I just kind of ranted my 30 seconds away already. So I would just say thanks for joining us. And really, honestly, thanks, Victoria, for putting this together. And thanks to Chief Wilson, who wasn't able to stay with us, but everyone on this panel, because when it comes to everyone brings a perspective that is going to make this happen in the end. And it is going to happen. It's just a question of when. And it's because of the work of animal science experts. It's because of the work of infectious disease experts. It's because of the tireless work of animal advocacy organizations like the Fur Bearers. And it's because of Indigenous voices that make it very clear that you can't co-opt their voices to defend practices like this that should not exist. And we see that too much in our politics. And so it's critically important we've got Chief Wilson here and other Indigenous voices on animal welfare issues, Marty Klein in the Senate, previously Marie Sinclair, who say, no, you can't co-opt our voices to mistreat animals. And so just thanks to everyone for their advocacy and their expertise, and everyone listening, make sure you write your MP and build that relationship that's so critical.
Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you.
And you know, I want to acknowledge MP Erickson Smith as well, like for being really open. You know, some politicians, animals are not a priority, will never be a priority, and they're not even open to listening, you know, to animal issues. And so I think it's great when we have politicians that are open, you know, to listening to their constituents. They're open to listening to experts and getting out back to this idea of getting out of these silos and not looking at it just as an animal issue, but understanding the complexities within it, that it's also a health issue, it's a Indigenous issue, it's an environmental issue. So I think that's really the future. I think anytime that we advocate for animals, I think we really need to expand our scope and look at the full spectrum and really invite other voices, and that diversity and that richness of perspectives. That's what moves people. And you know, I've seen it in this campaign, and I'm really hopeful for the future, you know, and that we can build off of this. And thank you very much for the moderation, Victoria, and for all your work on the issue as well. You've been really active on the fur farming issue, and we can't thank you enough for all your support.
Well, thank you. I'm going to close our speakers' comments at this point, and I want to thank everybody very much for this wonderful discussion, all the information that you've shared, and thank you to everybody who submitted questions. We couldn't get to all of them, but don't forget that you could also ask your questions privately if you wish to. You can go in through the through our emails, and you can ask a question on Twitter. You can get to us. And also, please don't forget that this and all the other sessions today have been recorded, so you will be able to access them for 60 days post-event. The Play to Win code for this session is one word: Fur Farming 334. Fur Farming 334. So please take a look at the chat if you need to confirm the spelling. Stay tuned for the closing remarks, as we have an unexpected surprise for you related to the Play to Win activity. And take a moment to look at the left-hand side of your screen to find a link to complete the post-survey session. Thank you for doing that. And the closing remarks are going to begin right away here on the PetSmart Charities of Canada stage. Please stay right here as I welcome back Barbara Cartwright and Kathy Duncan from Humane Canada. So thank you very much, everybody, for being with us. And I hope you've enjoyed this conversation that we've had with some of the absolute top experts in Canada. I can't thank them enough for agreeing to be on this panel when I contacted them months ago, and everybody said yes. And so we are hoping that people will continue to participate in these issues post-conference, post-summit. and to unpack as you go. So thank you very much. And as I say, we are now going to welcome back Barbara Cartwright and Kathy Duncan. Thank you all.